In this lesson, we're going to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So example 1, how do I complete the square? All right, so it says ax squared plus bx plus c is a perfect trinomial if we can factor it into the square of a binomial, meaning that we've got the two binomials that are the same. Remember in chapter 9 when we found the special products of the polynomials where we had a plus b squared was equal to, then we had the a squared plus 2ab plus the b squared. And then we had the same thing then when we had the a minus b squared, that ended up being an a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. All right, so let's take a look at what that kind of looks like here. So if I were going, all right, so I have x squared plus 8x plus 16. I want you to recognize when something is a perfect square trinomial. Because notice where I have a 1 here, and the square root of 1 times 1 is 1, and I can take the square root of 16 because 4 times 4 is 16. This would be considered a perfect square binomial. Because if I took this x, and I have this x, and I have a 4, and I have a 4, and now we know that this is going to be x plus 4 squared. Remember, if I were to take these to get our middle terms, I'd have 4x plus 4x, and that is equal to 8x. That's what makes then that work for the perfect square binomial. So let's go ahead then and take a look at our next one. And I have 25x squared plus 30x plus 9. And again, let's notice that the square root of 25 is 5 and the square root of 9 is 3. And so if I come take this one, I'd have 5x, and I'm going to have 5x here, and I have a 3 and a 3 to make up the 9. And so I'll have 5x plus 3 squared for this one here. All right, so example number 2, how do I make a perfect square trinomial? All right, so what we're looking for is we're going to be looking for this value right here, that's c in our equation. And so what we have here then is I have the x squared plus 10x plus something. And so remember that this number right here, in order to find the c, that we took 10 divided by 2, and I get 5, and then I'm going to square that, and that's where I'm going to get the c. It's going to be the 25. And so let me show you what that looks like then down here. When you would factor that, you'd have your x, and you'd have your x, and then I'd have my 5 and my 5, and then that's where we have the pluses. And notice then this is the perfect square trinomial, and then how you'd have this, you'd have x plus 5 squared. All right, so let's take a look at this next one. We have x squared plus 14x plus something, all right? So we're going to take, again, we're taking this middle term right here, and I'm going to take 14, and I'm going to divide that by 2, and I'm going to get 7, and then I'm going to square that, and that's how I'm going to get this number right here. And so if you look at what this would look like then factored, you'd have x plus 7 and x plus 7, and then that would be x plus 7 now squared, all right? And notice how that's how we got that 14, is that we've got the 7x and we've got the 7x. That's how we get that 2 in the middle, that 2ab. And so let's take a look at the next one. We're going to complete the square again. And I'm going to take my middle term here, and I'm going to take negative 16, and I'm going to divide that by 2, and I get negative 8. And so now I'm going to take negative 8 squared, and I get 64. And I just want you to look and see what this one looked like then before we factored. You'd have your x and you'd have your x, and then you'd have your 8 and your 8. And because we had that minus there, I would have minuses here, giving me then the x minus 8 squared. All right, so let's go ahead and let's continue to complete the square. So I'm going to have x squared minus 24x, and so I'm going to take that middle term right here. I'm going to have negative 24, going to divide that by 2, and I get negative 12. And so then I'm going to square that, and then I would end up then with 144. All right, our next one then. Okay, now this one's going to turn out as a decimal. Notice I can't take half of 15 without getting a decimal. So I'm taking half of 15, and I'm getting 7.5, and then again I'm going to square that. And when I do that, I get 56.25. Right, and our last one to complete the square, I'm going to have our middle term. We're taking half of that, so negative 5 divided by 2, you get negative 2.5, and then I'm going to square that. And so when I do that, I'm going to then have 6.25. So in example number 3, we're going to then use this method of completing the square to solve an equation. And so when we do that, we are going to take this first part right here, and I'm just going to write down x squared minus 16x, and it's going to be plus something, is equal to, now let's think about what has to happen when you solve an equation. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. And so if I'm going to complete the square, I need to then also do whatever number I had here. I need to add it to the other side. So again, we're going to take negative 16 divided by 2, so half of that is 8, and 8 squared is 64. So to complete the square, I'd have 64, and so if I added 64 to this, we're going to add 64 to this. And we'll have negative 9.12. All right, so notice how in this one I have x squared minus 12x plus 22 is equal to 0. And we want to solve this by completing the square. So let's go ahead and we're going to minus the 22 on both sides. And so now I've got my x squared minus 12x is equal to negative 22. So when I go to solve this then by completing the square, I'm going to have x squared minus 12x plus something is equal to negative 22 plus something. So now I'm going to take half of negative 12 is 6, and negative 6 squared is 36. So if I do that there, I have to do that here. And so when I factor that, I'm going to and x and 6 and 6. And now notice there is a minus there, so these are going to be minuses. And that's going to be equal to then 14. 14. All right, so now let's go ahead and I'm going to have x minus 6 and then squared is equal to then 14. So we're going to then take the square root. So x minus 6 is equal to plus or minus, when I take the square root of that, it's going to be 3.7. All right, so I have x minus 6 is equal to 3.7, and x minus 6 is going to be equal to negative 3.7. And so I'm going to have two values here, and x is going to be equal to 9.7, and x is going to be equal to 2.3. All right, and our last one. All right, again, because we're going to be completing the square, we're going to move that 7 by adding it. And so x squared plus 6x plus something is going to be equal to 7 plus something. All right, half of 6 is 3, and 3 squared, that is 9. So I've got to do that to both. And now we're going to factor it, x, and 3, and I've got my plus is equal to 16. X plus 3 squared is equal to 16. And I have x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus 4. And so then I'm going to have x plus 3 is equal to 4. X plus 3 is equal to negative 4. And x is going to be equal to 1, and x is going to be equal to negative 7. So in this lesson, we took a look at solving quadratics by completing the square.